On the morning of November 6, 1895, an 18-year-old girl sat weeping in her Manhattan bedroom while a footman stood guard outside her door. Even her own governess was turned away. She cried for hours, so hard that her maids would battle to hide the swelling on her face. And then she was led to a church on Fifth Avenue and handed to a stranger, along with $2.5 million. Most people remember Consuelo Vanderbilt as the fairy tale Dollar Princess, who became an English duchess. But the real story is far darker and much more disturbing, because 31 years later, in a Vatican courtroom, a single sworn confession would finally reveal what actually happened to her. And who was responsible? Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on March 2, 1877, in New York City, into a fortune so vast it barely had rivals on earth. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was heir to the railroad empire founded by the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. Her mother was Alva Erskine's Smith, a Southern belle with iron ambition, a ferocious temper, and one burning grievance. Old New York society treated the Vanderbilts as vulgar new money. Alva intended to fix that, whatever it cost. And from the moment her only daughter was born, Consuelo was part of the plan. Her childhood reads less like an upbringing and more like a training program. She was educated entirely at home by governesses, drilled in French, German, and deportment. By her own later account, she was made to do her lessons wearing a steel rod strapped along her spine to force perfect posture. And she recalled that minor infractions could be punished with a riding crop. Whether every detail is exact, the theme is beyond dispute. Alva controlled what Consuelo wore, what she read, who she saw, and what she was allowed to think. Years later, Alva herself would describe her authority over her daughter in words so chilling they'd end up in a court record. That admission was still decades away, but the power it described was built right here in the nursery. Because there was one thing Alva wanted more than acceptance from New York society. She wanted to conquer the oldest aristocracy on earth. American heiresses were crossing the Atlantic to marry cash-starved European noblemen. Money for titles, titles for money. The press called them dollar princesses. Alva looked at her beautiful, obedient, exquisitely trained daughter and saw the greatest bargaining chip in America. There was just one problem. Consuelo had fallen in love with someone else. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, a handsome New York sportsman from an old, respected family, roughly 15 years her senior. By the age of 17, Consuelo had secretly promised to marry him. It was the first real decision she had ever made for herself. It would also be the last one her mother ever allowed her. In 1895, Alva engineered a meeting between her daughter and Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was 24, slight, imperious, and known by the nickname Sonny, short for one of his courtesy titles, not his personality, which was a good thing, because warmth was not among his qualities. Sonny had inherited Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest houses in England, and a mountain of debt threatening to bury it. He needed money on a scale only America could supply. Alva had money on a scale only America could supply. The two of them understood each other perfectly. The only person who hadn't agreed to the arrangement was the bride. When Consuelo refused the match and made her feelings for Rutherford known, Alva's response was not an argument. It was a siege. She locked her daughter in her room. She intercepted and destroyed her letters, so that Consuelo's pleas never reached Rutherford, and his replies never reached her. And she told her daughter, flatly, that if the engagement continued, she would shoot Winthrop Rutherford dead. These are not tabloid inventions. The confinement, the intercepted letters, and the death threat were later confirmed in the findings of a Vatican tribunal. A teenage girl in a Fifth Avenue mansion kept under lock and key until she surrendered, and Alva still had one weapon left, the cruelest of them all. Consuelo later wrote that her mother took to her bed and claimed she was dying, that a doctor solemnly informed the girl her defiance was destroying Alva's heart, and that her mother might not survive the strain. Faced with the choice between her own future and, as she believed, her mother's life, Consuelo broke. She agreed to marry the Duke. Almost immediately, Alva made a jaw-dropping recovery. The engagement was announced in September 1895, and New York society erupted in celebration of the fairy tale. No one outside that house knew the bride had been a prisoner in it. Then came the paperwork, because this fairy tale had a contract. Under the marriage settlement, 50,000 shares of Beech Creek Railway stock, valued at exactly $2,500,000, were placed in trust for the Duke of Marlborough, with a guaranteed income of $100,000 a year. Depending on how it's measured, that principal is worth somewhere in the region of $80 to $90 million today. The documents are real, public, and precise. Some historians resist the word sold, but it's hard to find a better one for a transaction. With a signed deed, a fixed price, and a human being at the center of it. And the wedding itself would strip away whatever romance was left. On the morning of November 6, 1895, Consuelo stood in her room in tears, guarded, isolated, refused even the comfort of her governess. She later described how her maids worked frantically with cold compresses to reduce the swelling in her face. And it still wasn't enough. The ceremony at St. Thomas Episcopal Church was delayed roughly 20 minutes while her father tried to calm her. When she finally walked down the aisle, past the massed flowers and the cream of American society, she was weeping behind her veil. In her memoir, she recalled the elaborate cosmetics of the day dissolving in streaks under her tears. Thousands of spectators mobbed Fifth Avenue to glimpse the bride of the century. None of them realized they were watching a girl being delivered. If Consuelo held any hope that her new husband might grow to love her. It reportedly survived less than the honeymoon. According to her memoir, the Duke informed her, during their honeymoon, that he was in love with another woman and had married Consuelo only because it was his duty to save Blenheim. Her recollection was written decades later, and no independent record confirms his exact words. But everything the Duke did afterward matched the sentiment perfectly. The money had been transferred. The rest was formality. And so, at 18, Consuelo was installed as mistress of Blenheim Palace, a house so vast it functioned less like a home and more like a beautiful, freezing institution. Her dowry went to work at once. Vanderbilt money shored up the crumbling estate, repaired the fabric of the palace, and funded the Duke's relentless campaign of restoration and improvement. The irony was brutal. Her fortune was rescuing one of the great architectural treasures of England, while she lived inside it in misery. She later described dinners with the Duke at opposite ends of a long table, the two of them sitting in silence so complete that messages between them were relayed by footmen. She described the crushing loneliness of endless formal evenings, and how she took up knitting garments for the local poor, a duchess in a palace, doing repetitive handwork to keep despair at arm's length. It seemed her role had been reduced to a single remaining function. And in the eyes of the aristocracy, it had. On September 18, 1897, Consuelo gave birth to a son, John, the future 10th Duke. A second son, Lord Ivor, followed in 1898. The succession was secure. In later years, the phrase, "an heir and a spare," was widely attributed to Consuelo herself, a dry, devastating summary of exactly what the arrangement had required of her. Whether or not she truly coined it, the point stands. She had delivered the last item on the contract. What remained was a marriage with no love, no warmth, and no purpose, between a man who had never wanted her and a woman who had never chosen him. Something had to give, and slowly it did. The marriage deteriorated through the early 1900s, with both husband and wife forming attachments elsewhere. And in 1906, after 11 years, the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough formally separated. For the aristocracy, it was a scandal. For Consuelo, it was oxygen. Because here is where the story turns. Where the girl who had never been allowed a single decision started making all of them. Freed from Blenheim, she threw herself into causes that had nothing to do with dynasties. Philanthropy, housing, the welfare of women and children. She became a genuinely effective public figure in London, and from 1917 to 1919, she served as an elected councillor on the London County Council, the sole bride of 1895, winning votes on her own name. The schoolbook version calls her life glitter. The truth is that the glitter was the prison, and everything admirable happened after she escaped it. In 1920, her father died, and in 1921, the civil divorce from the Duke was finalized at last. 26 years after the wedding. And that same summer, on July 4th, 1921, Consuelo did something she had been denied at 18. She married for love. Her new husband was Jacques Balsan, a French aviation pioneer, a warm, adventurous man who adored her. They settled in France, and biographers describe the homes she made there as flooded with windows and sunlight. Houses that read like a deliberate, room-by-room rejection of Blenheim's cold magnificence. She built a children's sanitarium. She entertained. She was, by every account, finally happy. But one door from the past remained locked. And in 1926, in Rome, something happened that would tear it open in the most shocking way possible. An event so extraordinary it made front pages on both sides of the Atlantic. It involved her mother. And it's the part of the story that was coming from the very beginning. First, the rest of her life. When war broke out in 1939, Consuelo and Balsan left France for the United States, settling in New York and Long Island. In 1953, she published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. Calm, elegant, and quietly devastating, the record of everything that had been done to her, written in her own voice at last. Then 1956 brought a double blow. Jacques Balsan died, and in the same year her younger son, Ivor, died of a brain tumor. Consuelo endured, as she always had. She lived on until December 6, 1964, when she died at Southampton, Long Island, at the age of 87. And her will contained one final, haunting instruction. She was buried at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, Oxfordshire, beside her son Ivor, within sight of Blenheim Palace. The woman who spent decades escaping that house chose, in the end, to lie down next to it forever. Perhaps it was for Ivor alone. All anyone can say for certain is that Blenheim never fully let her go. But the real story, the one behind that weeping girl under guard in 1895, was settled back in 1926 in front of the sacred tribunal of the Rota in Rome. Consuelo had petitioned the Catholic Church to annul her first marriage. A process that began in the diocesan court and rose to the Vatican's highest marriage tribunal. An annulment isn't a divorce. The Church doesn't dissolve a marriage. It rules that a true marriage never existed at all. And there is one classic ground for that ruling: that consent was never freely given, that the bride was coerced. To prove it, the tribunal needed testimony from the one person who knew exactly how Consuelo's consent had been manufactured, which is how. 31 years after the wedding, Alva Vanderbilt, by then Alva Belmont, one of the most famous suffragists in America, a woman who had spent years and millions campaigning for women's freedom, took an oath and confessed, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke." She testified, adding that she had always held absolute power over her. The very power built in that nursery with the steel rod, the same power that had locked the bedroom door in 1895. The champion of women's rights, admitting on the record that her own daughter's marriage was an act of force. On August 19, 1926, the tribunal annulled the marriage on the grounds of coercion, and newspapers around the world printed the confession. There was no dramatic reconciliation scene, no recorded apology, just a mother handing over the single truth her daughter needed, the only gift that could still matter. The tyranny that had caged Consuelo became the testimony that freed her. In the eyes of the church, the wedding of the century, the flowers, the crowds, the $2.5 million had never happened at all. The only thing about it that was ever real was the girl crying behind the veil.